Hello everybody, we're going to be working on Chapter 7 tonight, which finally moves us away from the database chapter and into what we call Action Pack. And notice that the topics here are working with a combination of the view and the controller to start doing some things. In Chapter 6, we spent a lot of time building up our database and the data models, learning how all of that works together. And before I go delving into Chapter 7, what I would like to do is take this particular version of my project. So I'm going to take this whole blog folder and just do a copy paste to version it. And I'm going to call that version Chapter 6 Complete. So now I have a starting point to work with, and I hope you guys do the same. All right, so let's go ahead and start digging into the material now. And they start to talk a little bit about some things that we've already did a little bit of talking about, but now we're going to go into some more depth. One thing that we did learn early on is the fact that when you type in a URL in this environment, whenever you use an MVC architecture, where one of the byproducts of the technology is a clean, logical URL structure that has nothing to do with folder and file structure. It has to do with controller structure, method structure, parameters, etc. And I think you guys are a little bit familiar with that already, so I'm not going to, over talk that particular point. But the pieces that we are working with in this Action Pack area really do focus more on the view and on the controllers and what the controllers do as opposed to the models. We're assuming now that the models that we have are basically where they need to be. So we have articles and users, and we even have hash passwords now, and categories and little links between all our different tables so that the data structure is somewhat logical. The first little example they walk into here is this thing called Action Controller. And they use an analogy which I think is kind of interesting, and it's not a bad analogy. So if you think about the fact that you have some music that you want to listen to, so they use the example of a CD player, and you think about the CD player, and the CD player is kind of an object, right? So, but the object has an interface. It has a spot where you can load up your music. It has a place where you can plug in your headphones. But more importantly, it has controls on the front panel that allow you to interact with the object. So like if you're thinking of a web application, that would be the example of you have a way to load data into your model, and then if you want it to do something, you interact with a controller, and the controller will receive the actions from the interface and then trigger whatever that action is, logically is what you would expect. So they give an example of like play, stop, fast forward, rewind, and eject. That's just an example. But the interface comparison, I think, is a good one. Because when we write a controller, we'll put a page up on the screen, and we might provide a number of different links or buttons that we can do, that we expect to perform certain actions, and hopefully they do. Now, in terms of what happens on the back end, well, if we were writing code for a CD player, we probably, on the back end, for the controller, have methods that look like this. So if we had a button named play, we'd probably want a method named play. Now, of course, what that nitty-gritty does, well, that's not really the point of that here, but the fact that we're calling it, that there's a structure present for it, that's really the important piece. It's going to be us who's going to control all of that, but notice that it's under our control. There's not a bunch of things that will happen just always automatically. When you get to a more complex application, you will have to individually build the methods inside of a controller to be able to interact with whatever's on the screen. In some cases, we will use auxiliary methods and what we call helpers to assist the controller to do some work. Long story short, regardless of what happens with any of those buttons that you press, whether it's on the CD player or on the screen, we do expect something to happen in the aftermath of pressing it. So if you press play on the CD player, you expect the music to play. And then what would happen for the user, I mean, aside from the fact that you would hear music, is maybe there's a little display on the player or a light or something that would indicate, yes, you are now playing that CD. And the correlation that they're giving for that is what we call the action view. So the action view is actually a kind of a collection of tools, if you want to think of it that way. I think they call it a library here, that is set up to react to whatever your controller does. So your controller might just code-wise say, all right, well, they clicked on that, well, just put this on the screen. Or it might run some programming logic, do some math, look some stuff up in the database, turn it into an object, manipulate that data, change it into something else, make a determination, output a string of text, and then send that back to the browser. We have no way of really knowing that unless we're designing it. But the point is that the controller does some sort of work, which in some cases may be as simple as generating a view or much more complicated, but ultimately we still expect something to come back to the screen no matter what we do, so we know something happened. That's how you keep an application kind of up and running. They give us an example here on the top of the next page, top of 124, of what we call an example view. So we really have a very basic HTML document here, but then notice that we have the ASP style delimiters within brackets. So we move away from the HTML code, and then all of a sudden we have these %sign bracketed codes, and you're going to see that these have various different formats. You're going to see that there's just the plain %sign. Then you're also going to see that there's one where there is an equal sign that follows, and they have special meanings. And then you're also going to see that there's an @ sign in front of it. And what that basically indicates is that whenever you have that @ sign in front of it, it is the instantiation of an object that's coming in from your data model. So that is data that's coming back to the screen. If we are outputting, for example, something to the screen that the user is actually going to see, then you have to have that equal sign in the mix, because this is going to output to the browser. And if you think of it like this, here we're going to be populating a list item. So what are we going to be populating that list item with? Article titles. So the equal sign really shows us that whatever we're pulling in from our application, however we're doing it, that's going to feed back to the view because of that equal sign. The line that precedes it, this is indicative that we're running a loop. And as we're running that loop, well, the logic of the loop is not going to propagate back to the screen. So I don't need an equal sign after that percentage point. It's just code. Now, the interesting correlation here is that this same exact approach is exactly what we use in ASP.NET. It uses the same delimiters and the same equal sign to push it back. Same thing happens here in the closing statement, because once again we're not pushing the end of the method or the end of the loop back to the browser, we're just telling that code to stop. So that's just in plain %sign code. Now, if we happen to know the name of those articles, it would loop through, let's say we had 3 items, it would loop through, read the title for each one, and then just bring that text and populate it. This approach of intertwining basically Ruby code with HTML code is called embedded Ruby. That's why we also have this special file extension that we're going to be using, which is a .erb file. So the way that you're going to see your file formats is you're going to have files that are index.html.erb. And that file will not render directly to the browser on its own. It does require the back-end Ruby code to run and do whatever logic it does to convert all of it into HTML. The outputted file is an HTML format. Whether or not the name of the file appears in the URL, that's irrelevant. But the format that we're pumping our view into is in this hybrid form of HTML and embedded Ruby code. Right? This is something that you might not be familiar with if you have not done other server-side languages, but if you have done PHP and ASP, which you should have, to get to this point, you should have encountered that. PHP, of course, uses a different style of tag than Ruby, but the concepts are essentially the same. Here's that little concept of helpers, and Action Pack, and a big part of it is the fact that sometimes controllers and views need a little extra something to get their work done. So we have this concept or this structure or tools, collection of tools called helpers, which do many predetermined tasks. So you basically have these little code libraries that are pre-written that do very particular things that help us get the view back up on the screen or run a snippet of code or whatever the task may be. But it helps us to do it.
But are these all methods? Individual methods?
They can be. Yes, they are individual methods that are part of a library. Yes. So the interesting thing about it, that's a really good question. You can also create your own helpers. So if you write a piece of code that you use all the time, you could save it as your own library and pull that in and utilize it as well. This particular helpers, they're just built into the language. So all you have to do in many cases is just call them.
Because I was looking through the blog directory, and there was a subdirectory called helper.
Yes.
So at first I thought maybe some of these are there, but they weren't.
Right, but that's where the helpers end up once you run it. So they create the folder structure for it, even if there's nothing populating it yet.
You mean your own helpers?
Yes, your own helpers. Yes, correct. Correct, Robert. All right. The other thing that we've already kind of learned is this whole concept of clean URLs. So like they give the example here of like this old school URL where if we were running, using an older language, and here they're giving the example of ASP. And I will tell you right now that in ASP, if you happen to be working with that old scripting language, this is how you would do it. If you wanted to put an article up on the screen, you'd probably call articles, call the script that runs it, and then via a get, following the question mark, you throw in a parameter to trigger the application to send data back. We've already seen that in Ruby on Rails, we have the capability to put in clean URLs that kind of do the same thing and really actually take it a little bit further, where we don't have to see the names of the files involved or the value of the key for the parameter variable name embedded into the URL. That's not necessary in how this works. So what that means is that we can create these URLs that look beautiful and are still just as effective. And the truth is, users don't want to be burdened with some cryptic looking URL, and for the most part aren't going to be typing in those URLs. The kind of applications that we're building at this point are applications typically that require a front-end login. So you're going to go to a system, and you're going to log into the site. And then from there, you're interacting with the screen to get to where you need to go. You're not putting in a finite URL to a specific resources in most cases at all. All right, let's talk about this concept now of REST. And REST is a kind of a conceptual construct that's used in a lot of these MVC style applications and really in a lot of modern web development. And REST, in terms of an acronym, stands for Representational State Transfer. Now, why this is important? HTTP is a stateless protocol. That means sitting on its own, it is not capable of keeping track of your session information. So if you log into a site, HTTP doesn't know. So what we need to do is we use the principles of REST in order to make sure that we do maintain state in our application. So for example, that we know that you're logged in or not logged in, or maybe when the last time it was that you were logged in, and what kind of actions you can perform relative to being logged in or not. So in some application languages, we refer to this as session state. But it's still the whole point of being able to, how do you say this, being able to maintain that state that you're currently in. Now, what's interesting about this is REST basically exists kind of in the form of an API, and what they're trying to show you with these two bulleted lists is what normally happens with an HTTP application where we do have get and post. And those are the ones that you learn typically when you first learn HTML, right? You learn that the default for submitting a form or sending any data from the browser to the server is in the form of a get. So if I click on a link, that whole link is passed through the URL. If I'm filling out a form though, and I don't want my user information, let's say that's in the form, to be transmitted within the URL, I use a post. And therefore the URL does not become burdened with that form contents or parameters being passed. Not that it's not being passed, but it's not visible to the user. Then we have these other two that are used basically, notice, to either modify a specific resource, what that is, who's to know, it's not really indicated, and then also delete, which can be used to hypothetically delete a resource. Now, if you think though that in terms of HTTP, what those things are really are highly dependent upon what's on the receiving end. In the old days, we would write CGI scripts where we would pass this information, and then that would be received on the server, and then whatever scripting language is running on the server would try to process it. When we use the RESTful approach, we use really a kind of a combination of modern APIs that are built right into the HTML5 standard that allow us to kind of use these things to really correspond more directly with database action. So that's really the point of the next bullet list, because if you look at it really carefully, you can see the Crud operations. So create, read, update, and delete. So post, when you're sending stuff to the server, hypothetically you're creating content. So let's say you're adding something to a database table. That's just a primitive example. The get, on the other hand, is more often used to read in information. Because if it is coming back from the server, do we really care that it's in the URL? Probably not, because it's ending up on our screen. So that's used more for read. The patch and the put, those are the ones that allow us to interact with data that's already present and change it. So changing, like one column in a table, and therefore corresponds with update. And then finally, to actually delete a resource using the delete method. All right, let's take a look at this graphic here real quick. And let's try to kind of trace through how this works. So imagine that you are sitting as a user at the browser, so the black box on the screen there. As you sit at the browser, you are going to go to the website, and you land on the website, and let's say you see an article link, and you click on that article link. And then in order to get to that article link, automatically generated for you just by virtue of the link, you're putting in a request to retrieve article with an ID of 1. That request is sent to the routing engine. So there is a routing engine in place that deciphers that request. And yes, there's a standard format that's followed, but you can also customize those routes too, which is an important aspect of this MVC thing. So just because you type in one path doesn't mean that that's where it ends up. By default, it will call first the controller, then a method, and then a parameter. In this case, what they put in calls in article with the ID of 1. So that routing is somewhat pre-configured. So there we have the controller, the action / method, and then the parameter or the ID. So this is done somewhat automatically, and yes, you can tweak that and adjust it, or you can create your own. Once it realizes where it needs to go and it hits the controller, it finds the right controller by name, then it finds whatever method is applicable, if at all. That method might require some interaction with your data model. Now remember, the data model is not necessarily your database, but it might be. It might be an instantiated version of the data in your database. On rare occasion, it might actually be the actual data in the database. Either way, if it requires data from the data model, it will pull it in, manipulate it, adjust it, just view it, whatever the case may be. When it's done with that action, then it's trying to get back to pushing something into the browser that you can see, and that's where we enter in with our embedded Ruby files. So now that we're sending something back to the screen, we need to be able to take our Ruby components, feed them into a web page, and then as the web page, go back to the screen, because ultimately all the user sees in the screen is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's what the browser is capable of rendering. We use those embedded Ruby files, though, to basically structure the application and the things that we see on the screen. All right, so in the next little section here, it says a controller walkthrough, and you can see that one of the first areas they go to is the routing engine. And the typical approach is what you see at the very bottom of the screen there. And you, and if you want to look, we actually have a file that's in our project. So we can go into the blog folder and see if I can remember where the heck it is. It's in the config folder, and you're going to see that there is a routes file. And if you go ahead and open that text file and take a look, notice that we have really not much in there. We did add this in at some point. It says resources articles. So it recognizes the name articles as being some sort of a resource. But there is, and I'm noticing that they don't have this in here anymore. But they used to have this line in here by default, and it said in the form of a get, in other words, appearing in the URL. That's what the get means. The name of the controller, optionally followed by the method, then by the ID, and then whatever particular format it needs to be within in order to work. So whether that ID is a string or that ID is a number. And typically it'll be one of those two things. All right. We've seen this whole thing before, so I'm not going to talk it to death. But in this case, when we would send in a path, right? So this would imply the Teams controller and the home method. This would trigger Teams index. So in other words, inside the controller, it's not called home, it's called index. So there'll be a method called index. Its job might be just to return an HTML view. That might be the case. In this particular case, we have the Teams controller, the search method, and then it looks like we're running a query. And notice the symbol form of the name. And then, of course, the version with the hash in there, which would trigger the actual content. So whatever you would type in would be searched, and that would be grabbed through that particular engine. We can actually also name our routes and control them. So for example, if we put in Teams #search, we can actually just substitute search, for example. And we could also add components where we create the links to that, so depending on what the outputs are, we can actually control things via the URL in a named fashion. So not just labeling it, but symbolically in the URL, if we type a certain thing, we can have it route to somewhere else. It's a little confusing at first, honestly, but once you see it in action, it makes a little bit more sense. Notice that you can also kind of combine these things both with not only a path to pull something back, but also trigger an action after it happens. So take a look at the third one, for example, where you're not only pulling an article with specific ID, but you're also going into edit mode. And what they're doing there in this little listing is they're showing you that we come up with these names, basically, like edit article path, that is representative of actually triggering that particular URL. Why that's powerful is we are able to just put in a friendly name for a URL that might be a little bit more complicated, and then therefore we have a name that makes more sense to us than would if you just looked at the URL itself. Although I think that URL is pretty descriptive, what if you had, names for things that really weren't that descriptive? That's kind of the point. All right, in this next section, they show some of the the things that are correlated together here in terms of things that are named into routes. And notice the combination here of what would happen by default depending on which request method you used and the naming convention that you've used to identify it. So there are kind of like approaches to doing this. So with the very first one, if you just say articles path, it's just going to create the index view. If you switch it to a post, though, and this is the part that confuses people, if the method is changed from get to post, then it puts you into create mode. Because it assumes that if you're posting, you're creating. You see the difference? Right? So we're in like a lot of other HTML formats, you can send the stuff to the database, with a get, you can send the stuff to the database with a post. It doesn't really care. This format does. They're saying, by convention, get is used to read things, post is used to create things, right? If you go to the next example, where you start to throw in the parameters, so notice the parameter column there. If I say get article path, whatever it is, ID, I'm showing it. And then if I'm going to put, and that's a different method that we haven't really used much, but it's going to also require not only the article path and ID, but whatever it is you're pushing back up to get updated is going to be embedded there in some sort of a hash, usually within curly brackets and key value pairs. And then that pattern continues. So like you can use this table then to kind of help guide you. But the truth is that for the most part, get is used to view things, post is used to create things, and then put, patch, and delete are used to actually change things on the far end. So it really sends a directive to the application that, hey, we're trying to perform some Crud operations here. So that a lot of that, frankly, happens on the back end. You don't really think about it much. But here's the thing that we can do. Why don't we go ahead and make this first little alteration. So this is the first actual piece of coding we're doing in this chapter. So we're going to go to the routes RB file, and we're going to copy that in. Now I do want to show you that first of all, I opened up this file, and I want you to notice the name difference, first of all. In the book, blog, application, routes, draw, do. For us, Rails, application, routes, draw, do. Version differences here, folks. You'd leave this alone for the most part. No reason to change it. But we are going to add that line in here that does this. So now what this tells us is it says that the root of our application, as soon as we hit whatever our URL is, so let's say we have a URL of like, joesblog.com. So if I landed at the root URL, the top level URL, it would automatically take us to articles, controller, and index method, which of course probably generates some sort of a view. So could I also just type joesblog.com/articles and get to the same place? Yes. But by default, you will be routed to this spot where otherwise you would normally have to type in a URL. Most applications operate this way. We are not working in a static HTML world now where you have just a plain old index.html file and that's where your application lands. It's done dynamically. It looks first at this routing engine and says, okay, well, you're at the root of my application. Where should I go? Oh, I'm going to go to your articles index page. Simple as that. Make sure you save that change too. Let's also take a look now at the controllers folder. So we're going to go in there and we're going to kind of like look at some of the things that already had happened. So let's find this particular file. So I'm going to find this this certain one here, and this is in the back to the root, and then app controllers, and this is the articles controller file. Let's open that one up. And let's start taking a look here, comparing a little bit. And I'm going to go method by method. First, we have before action. So it's giving us some of these defaults here. We have an index method. And the index method, what does that do? It takes all the articles and puts them into an instantiated object and show it. Now, you see there's no HTML here, right? This is the controller file. This is not where that is generated. We also have methods for show, for new, and notice article equals article.new. For edit, we don't have any directives for edit yet, nor do they here. Then we go into the create method, and you can see the create method does have some things. And we want to be really careful here about the syntax and what is listed. For create, we are doing article.new here. We also have a respond to, and in the form of a loop. We're going to save the article, and I'm looking really carefully at this line by line and comparing with the book. Now, my question for you is did we write any of this? No. So how did it get here? It was the scaffolding that did this work for us. Because these are basic CRUD operations, there's a certain way they're always handled. Okay, so they do have these little methods in here. So if you save the article and it's successful, it's going to show you that it was successfully created. Otherwise, it's going to try to get you to figure out what went wrong and hopefully have you fix it. As you move down, now we're in the section where they do patch and put. So you can see the methods have changed. But for update, that's the approach that you use. This looks very similar to the create, which is above. And I do notice that there are some real slight differences here. So with update, I don't know if you guys are noticing this, right? Notice, or actually that is almost identical, isn't it? And notice this line here. And I'm not really tempted to change this at this point, especially given the fact that it's been automatically generated. I'm not really eager to go change that. Could I? I could. What I'm chalking it up to is a change in the rendering engine in the background that did this automatically, so this must be a better way to do it. That's my assumption. Let's check destroy. Of course, this version seems like it has a little bit more verbose content. And then finally, there's a private section down here where we set the article. That looks okay. And then this all looks okay. So I'm just trying to make sure that everything matches up. I did notice a couple minor differences, but I'm chalking those up to the automatic engine in the background. So I'm not going to be changing it. Next thing that we're going to look at here in the same controller, so they're not getting you anywhere else, is this little piece that's way up here on line 7. And really kind of getting to understand that. So that at articles, I mean, that is like a generic construct that we're building. It's a variable name that's capable of holding complex objects. And depending on how many articles you're going to have in your application, that's going to be like a whole array of arrays, really, if you think about that, right? Because each article entry is a row of a table, which is an array in itself to begin with. Here we're going to build a complicated structure, and it's all going to be held in that one spot. they give some examples here of some output. And what I'd like to do at this point is really kind of focus more on what the book is doing right here. So it's pointing out the fact that when we launch our web server and we go to this URL, and the truth is with that routing that we just put in, if we omit articles, it will still go to the same spot. But when I run that command, by default, it'll run the index method in the controller. You can see off to the left side of the screen there, where it takes all the articles and places them into that one object, and then that is put up on the screen. The format that it's placed into, and this is what they're trying to show us here, is see how they're like putting things into a JSON format. And JSON, of course, stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which is the information that's coming back from our application is being serialized into JavaScript code, which is basically inside of curly brackets with key value pairs separated by commas. The output you're seeing on the screen here is an XML output of that data. So in the old days, XML was kind of like more preferred, and lately people have been using JSON to replace it. But either mechanism can really pull that data back. So how is it being rendered to the screen? It's being turned into code that can then be displayed. This is the output of it if you look at it in XML format. Now, can I ask you, did you try that in your browser? And did you get that exactly what you saw on the screen? No? Okay. Yeah, and it's not that big of a deal, but it's kind of interesting to note that a lot of the applications that we use out there that are built with software like this, when we're pulling stuff back from a database, we can often format it in that form. In fact, whenever you go to like a newspaper website or a blog website and they have that little RSS logo, if you know what I'm talking about, you know this thing, you see this on websites all the time, you can actually click that link on a lot of websites, and what it'll do is it'll just pull back the raw data that's coming onto the page without all the formatting. And it was kind of a thing for a while, and I think it's kind of gone out of favor a little bit, frankly, where people would have RSS readers. So like if you wanted to look at like news feeds of particular data, you could just have a thing that read the feeds and bypass, you know, publishers' websites for all intents and purposes, which was kind of useful in some ways. But what a lot of websites have come onto is the fact that, well, hey, if people can just pull our data, then they don't get to look at our advertising, right? And so that's one of the reasons why that's fallen out of favor, right? How, you know, there's no free lunch, right? So it's somehow you got to get that ad on your screen. Then some of them went as far as actually embedding advertising components into their feeds, making it part of their database, you know, and running some sophisticated scripts to do that. So this is kind of an interesting thing, and why it's kind of come out of favor, really, to do it that way. Really, it's just kind of a logical thing. All right, the other thing that that we can do is we can actually put in redirects, and that's kind of the point of this little section. So if you wanted, you could actually redirect people to a different path completely from what they were even intending to see. Now, that's kind of, you know, kind of dastardly and tricky, but at the same time, if you really have something that's kind of complicated to get to within your application, it gives you the ability to create a custom route to get people to a certain spot without them having to figure out how to do it. So that's, I think, a really cool advantage, absolutely. All right, let's get to the templates. All right, so in the template section here, let's take a look at some of the ones that kind of happen automatically, because we certainly didn't create these, did we? So they have us go look in this directory. So app, views, articles. So go to your folder, go to app, views, and articles. Now, let's take a look at all the contents that are inside here, compare with the list that we see in the book. So the first thing I want you to see is that we have some things that have underlines in front of them. You see those? And then we have some things that don't. The underlines in front of something indicate what we call a partial. Okay, so that means a partial view. The other ones are what we call complete views. Notice that some of them have these JBuilders and some of them are ERBs. All right. The ERBs are the embedded Ruby files that we're talking about. Maybe not a bad place to start is to actually look at the index file. So if I go inside here, I notice, as we notice, right at the top, that there's HTML. But I'm also seeing that this is not the whole page. Right? In fact, this would be probably the body section of the page. This is the content that would be inserted into some other template. So somewhere we have, you know, the template that drives the whole website, that has the doc type and, you know, the HTML tag and the head tag where the CSS and the JavaScript are. And for that matter, even the body tag, because I don't see the body tag here. Because this is in the articles folder, this is the piece that builds the index view for our articles. And notice, if you look at this carefully, that it begins by, well, it's got some sort of a field for notice. And this is actually a place where we can inject information from our application. Right here, we can insert notices. So we can populate a variable called notice. When the page renders, there'll be a message. You know, record retrieved successfully, or item deleted, or something like that, or welcome to the website, or whatever we want it to say. Then we have an H1 and the beginning structure of a table, with the first row of the table, where we have a number of different columns, and notice how they correspond to the article columns. And then we go into the body of the table, and then here's where we see our embedded Ruby code. And what this is, of course, is a loop that will go through and read through each article, and for each article create a new table row, a new table data cell, and then populate each table data cell with information from that particular entry in the table. One by one, it'll keep looping through until all the articles are listed. This is embedded Ruby, folks. If you look at the web browser version of that, this is what the output would look like. So in this case, it looks like there's, you know, a few tables, I mean a few articles in there for each article. Assuming there's only 3, you go through and you read the title, location, the excerpt if there is one, the body, the published at, and then we also have the links. And notice here, link to, link to, link to, show, edit, and destroy. Show, edit, and destroy. And that's all generated automatically. If I had 100 records in here, I'd have 100 items listed. All right, so you're getting the point now that for articles, we have this index view. And if you went to all the different views, they have views created for all the things related to articles. So if I did, for example, a show of an article, right? So I want to show an article. There's show for articles. If I take a look at it, this will show me the format in which it's placed on the screen. So just a bunch of paragraph tags. We'll have the title, pulls in the title. Location, pulls in location, etc., etc., etc. And then links back to the other parts of the application.
Is it where you can see that the user seems to be using it?
Right, and if you wanted to add it in, you could add it in. Now here's the challenge to that though, Robert. So this is like your question. Do I want people to be able to change the user of an article? How should that be controlled? Really the way it should be controlled is when you log in and you create an article, it knows you're logged in and it adds your user to the article table. That should not be something where you could walk in and say, hey, I created this, but you know what, I'm going to blame Joe for it. And here, I'm going to change his name. Now it's Joe's. Right. Maybe an admin can do that, but regular users certainly shouldn't be able to. If you want to show that column, right, you could. Although they're going to assume that if it's your article, why would we show it? So, I mean, these are things you have to think about when you're building the application. What's the logic behind it? And there's a logic why some things are default as well. Now, the next section of the book where they start to talk about layouts, well, we're looking at basically views that are generated for particular page components which are being injected into a layout. So you want to think about a layout. Think of a layout as like a master page in an ASP.NET file, or an include page in a PHP file, right? Where you have a structure where you have your header and your footer and all those pieces, and then all you're interjecting is the new content, so you can pump everything into the same format. So if you want to take a look at one of those, we can go to App Views Layouts. Let's do that. Let's go to App Views Layouts. So these are the structural pages, and the one that's being used for the application as a whole. Now here I see my doc type, right? I see the head part of my document, and notice inside the head part of the document here, if I bump up the text size a little bit, that there's these placeholders. So we have our ASP style tags with the equal sign, meaning that we will receive information from the application that will populate this. So if we have meta tags that we're inserting, it'll drop them in here. If we have a style sheet link that we're adding, it will drop it in here. If we're including JavaScript, it will drop it in here. And then the part that we see on the screen, the body part, will be the yield. What goes into the yield? Well, if I was building the index page for articles, this would go into the yield. This code would be inserted into this area. That way, you can set up your document structure for your entire website with the same header, the same footer, whatever it is that you're doing, and then you're just injecting content, into the body where you need it to go. And yes, it can get more sophisticated than this. And yes, you can totally customize it with custom HTML, CSS, JavaScript. You want to marry other languages in there too. You want to throw PHP in, do that. You could. I don't know why you would, but you could. So this is kind of like your structure, and then you're basically inserting most of your content into that particular area. So here they're just doing a little bit of a talk about the exact same thing that I'm talking about here. Just showing you that all the stuff that you create in those individual view folders all get inserted into that one yield tag. All right, so they have certain rules that they follow here. So let's go ahead and go to this file now. Let's go to app views articles new. App views articles new. We don't have that one open yet. So we go to views, articles, and new, and let's open that up. Inside here, they want us to take a look at a couple of different things. First of all, I do want you to notice that there's been a little bit of an update here. So I want you to notice that render form has some additional content in there. We didn't put it in there. It was done automatically, so we are leaving it alone. The link to, that'll take us back to where we came from. That stays unchanged. But they want us to really look at, more particularly, that they render the form inside here. What form? Whatever form reacts with article. So there's a standard form that we render in position here to be able to change stuff in article. Where does that come from? Well, if you go back here and you notice we have a form, here's your form. Now if you go inside here, you're going to see a mix of HTML and embedded Ruby code. So you'll see, for example, text fields and labels. Pretty easy to read. And there's reasons why we are using Ruby code here and not straight HTML. Because the Ruby code can interact with the back end of the Rails application and the database. On the client side, when the user sees this, they see standard HTML. But this is being rendered server side and then pushed to the browser. This code ends up here. Then this code ends up here. So really what we have is kind of like a sophisticated layering of little pieces. So we don't pull in the form for articles until it's needed. We didn't create the form for articles. It was automatically generated based upon the type of data that's in that table and its data structure. It auto-created this. If we want to write something different for here, we could certainly do that. Certainly. If you take a look at the edit, and I don't know if I have that one up on screen here. I do not. So let's open that one. There's edit. And take a look at that structure. So once again, if we were doing an edit, it would bring up that same form, right? The difference would be that it's actually inserting the content, right, from the database that pre-exists. That's done automatically, folks. So what this architecture really kind of recognizes is the fact that if we're dealing with data on the back end, and we're dealing with a basic page structure on the front end, and we're inserting our content into it, there's certain predetermined types of things that we would normally do that we can pre-create so that the user does not need to create them. All they need to do is come in here and customize them. Or add additional functionality, or maybe subtract functionality for all I know. I would think it'd be more add functionality than anything else. So anytime that we start generating a view for any sort of a structure within our application, you're going to get a new folder that's going to match up to a controller, to a view, and possibly to a model. Okay, so hopefully that brings a little clarity to it. I don't know if it does for you or not. All right, let's go back to this whole concept of partials here, and this is where they're actually looking at that form file again. So this of course, is a partial, but this, so you might say to yourself, like, so what's the big deal with a partial? Well, with a partial, we're recognizing that if we're interfacing with this particular table, whether we're creating a new record or we're updating an existing one, the form that we would use would be the same. Why create two different ones if you're using the same thing each time? Granted, when I hit the button to save it or update it, it might trigger different functions, right? But if you're creating something new, or if you are changing something that exists, this partial form would come into play. So that's just a way of like making sure you don't repeat yourself. You know, and they go through and they show what's going on. And really what they're asking you to do in this section, if you want to get persnickety about it, is go ahead and run the application, bring up the article form, then do a right-click view source and take a look at the output. And then you'll see something that looks like this, where it all turns into HTML. So you're not seeing Ruby code in there, right? So you guys realize that piece. That Ruby code runs on the server and generates HTML for us. Simple as that. That gets pushed back out to the screen, and ultimately this is what the user sees. All right, at this point, we're getting up to form helpers. So we have helpers that are added to MVC applications, and this is true in many different styles of MVC application, that you get helpers that are designed to help you and your users more effectively use your forms without doing a lot of unnecessary coding. So one thing that you'll see is that you'll have tools that help you work with your data. And then you'll also find tools that help you with the tags that you create in the output area. So those are important to note. And you know, they give an example here how you're going to use some Ruby code that says form.label, and what's it for? It's for title, and form.textfield title, and then it'll turn into, for example, this. And depending on what your formats are, your input areas might look like this. It's all really kind of dependent upon the type of data that you're using. So a text area would turn into a text area. Some things are default, but some things are actually predetermined. And what is it predetermined by? So for example here, where you see article title and it says size 30, where's the 30 coming from? That's coming from the database. So one of the advantages of actually doing it with text field title is pulling it in from your data model. The data model is tied to the database, which has constraints placed on it, right? So it knows that it's a string, and it knows that it has this many character limit, for example, and it can pull that in and actually generate the HTML to match, so people aren't typing in something that's longer. So that's actually pretty powerful when you start to think about that. All right, so I think that you get the general idea here. Some of the form helper pieces that are available are the ones you see listed here, so text field, hidden field, password. They all correspond to HTML5 tags. Text areas, checkbox, radio box, file field. And you know what? There's even more of them now. All right, folks, we are at that point where, believe it or not, time has lapsed already. And I think we're going to say that we've gotten up to this point. And they actually have a couple little links here, and I don't know if these are still active or not. But we'll say that we've gotten up through page 142, and next week when we convene, we'll pick it up right from here.